JG, when it comes to the U.S. and China, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. You've said before that if it comes to an all-out trade war, the U.S. will win because they have a more elastic economy. China does not. How does all that play in with the upcoming election? Would China rather see Trump? Would they rather see Biden? And what would a Biden presidency look like and its approach to China?
Starting with the political side, the only thing that Americans seem to have bipartisan agreement on, the parties are so different and so opposed. They agree on China's a bad guy, and we're going to get China. Trump has opened up the door to get China. My suspicion is that if Joe Biden wins the presidency, I would use as a model for how he approaches China is the way Ronald Reagan and his team approached Japan in the first half of the 1980s. Japan was doing many of the same things China is. It wasn't behaving well, and it was, basically gnawing away at the U.S. industrial base. And Ronald Reagan sent a team over, and they negotiated, and they pushed Japan pretty hard. And I think that's what Joe Biden will do. You'll have a seasoned president, open to negotiation, and a seasoned team. Reagan was an experienced politician, no matter what you thought of him, and he sent a strong team over there. Donald Trump is an inexperienced politician, and he sent a weak team over outside of Robert Lighthizer. I think Joe Biden will send a very strong team over, and they'll work something out, and China will have to give way on a number of things. Some of them are trickier because it's intellectual property. That wasn't as big an issue back in the 80s. Like autos were huge then. But autos are still a real issue between them, and there's a lot of intellectual property embedded in that. So I would think that would be the approach of Joe Biden. It'll be tough on China, but it will work. It'll create the conditions for a negotiated settlement, not all-out trade war. And under any circumstance, whether it's a negotiated semi-trade war under Joe Biden or all-out war under President Trump, the U.S. economy gets knocked down, it gets kicked in the face, and it gets up and it drives forward. Americans get up and do that. That can-do attitude. They did it after 9/11. They'll do it again. It's a flexible, adjusting economy. China was slowly moving in that direction based on the reforms started in 1989 by Deng. And President Xi is reversing that. He's undermining the private sector, boosting the state-owned enterprises, which are bankrupt and inflexible. He's creating more of a Stalinist, Maoist type economy, and if the Americans poke it hard enough, it'll shatter.
There's some people that think that China's going to blow up anyways. And so can you give us your views a little bit on China's got this huge, they've made all kinds of investments, but there's a lot of inefficient investments they've made also. What do you think ultimately happens to China?
And by asking that, John, are you talking about the economy imploding and the regime falling as well, toppling?
John's absolutely right. We need to think about the potential for a change at the top of the regime, and that may come fairly quickly. I've read stuff, and you always have to. I read it from what seemed to be pretty.
You read
good.
it on Facebook?
No, I got it on Twitter by linking to some serious research behind it, like foreign policy and stuff like that. The Deng family is off in some city in China, and they're opposed to Xi. So there is an opposition in China, and before Trump, before COVID-19. China, and this has been discussed for a number of years, China has to go through a very challenging and difficult transformation from an economy driven by exports and by very heavy equipment manufacturing and that infrastructure. It needs to create more of a balanced service economy, one that trades services as well. So it needs to be a more modern 21st century type economy. It used to be a 20th century economy, but now 21st. And there was a big debate before any of this happened. Will they be successful? The worst case scenario is they become Japan, and their economy blows up. They have a demographic problem, and they go into a prolonged deflationary funk like Japan has. Japan's done a bit better than people think, because when you look at the increase in GDP per person, because the people are going down, it's actually pretty good. But they've made huge investments offshore. But even then, they've got a big debt problem. They've got this demographic problem, inequality problem. China would have that is going to have that as well. So do they grow 3% and be successful at that transformation, or do they blow up and grow 1%? Was there before Trump, before COVID-19, and the reality of China going forward is going to be very different. And there's serious academic people doing work on this. Stephen Roach from Yale University, formerly Morgan Stanley, is very bullish. George Magnus at UBS, he's at Oxford now, formerly of Union Bank of Switzerland, has written a book on it, that he thinks that G is in trouble, big trouble. And there's another guy who used to work on Wall Street, Michael Pettis, written a number of books on this. He's at Peking University now. He's an academic. He's in the optimistic camp, but and that's 3 to 4% growth at the absolute outside, maybe even 2 to 3. But they need huge structural reform, huge social reform, and the regime shows no signs of doing that. So no matter what scenario, China has big challenges ahead.
You mentioned social reform. We see pockets of social unrest in China, and then they tamp it down, and we only see as much as they let us see, basically. But do you see social unrest becoming an issue to the point that that would lead to a confluence of events toppling the regime?
Possibly. They've had big events like the Tiananmen Square. They've had this before, and this survived. Hong Kong may be a bigger challenge, because that's their conduit to the world. And I probably misspoke when I said social reform. I meant more social programs and reform in terms of creating a
social safety net.
Social safety net for the citizens. People in China save a lot because they don't have health care, they don't have pensions, so they live on their savings. And now they don't have as many children to support them in the fields. So to get people to spend more and create more of a consumer type economy, they need to put in a backstop. It's easier to be an entrepreneur, and it's easier to go out and make some investments in things if you have a safety net behind you. So I think that's an issue.